do that. It might be short.
It'll just guide me.
Should we introduce ourselves, or was someone going to get the session started? Nick Maisky, Nick Pachwe, good morning.
Tatsalach inam latiwa kahimima inawana kesa wanex wawakia alpel. I'm from the Umatilla Confederated Tribes that is located in Pendleton, Oregon. I work with the Department of Natural Resources. I'm the Public Education and Outreach Specialist. And thank you for tuning in for our presentation today.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having us today. My name is Colleen Sanders, and I am the Climate Adaptation Planner for the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. And I work within the First Foods Policy Program within the Department of Natural Resources for the tribe. And it has been my honor to be in this role for about 6 years now. And it's been especially an honor. I am not an Indigenous person, nor am I a tribal member. And so being able to be part of this work has been life-changing and something that I carry with a great responsibility. And I think we're going to chat with you here today about our First Foods mission and how that has informed our climate adaptation plan and the work that the tribe does to prepare our communities and our people for an uncertain future, but one that can be prosperous and one that has an opportunity to foster environmental justice. So thank you for being here with us today.
Today I'll be starting us off, and we're going to be talking about our First Foods mission and how we're working towards that and the work that I do as a public educator on behalf of my tribe and my people and our 7 generations and what that looks like for us. The Confederate Tribes of the Umatilla Inner Reservation signed their treaty in 1855. After this treaty was signed, it was ratified, meaning that it was put into place and active. There are some tribes throughout the country that are not ratified, and so their treaties and the treaty that was done doesn't come into play, and they don't have the rights related to that treaty when it was signed. You find that a lot more either on parts of the East Coast and back to the West after some of the states started signing into legislation. So the Confederate Tribes of the Umatilla Inner Reservation is made up of 3 tribal bands, which are the Cayuse, meaning superior people, the Umatilla, the Umatillas, and the Walilapu, the Walla Walla bands. During that time when the treaty was signed, we gave over 6.4 million acres of land. And in the area of where you see the reservation and the reservation boundaries, the gray is representative of that 6.4 million acres that was ceded in Northeast Oregon, Southeast Washington. You have the borders up here of Washington, and then Oregon's down below. We have this little area where you have green, and that is where the Umatilla Reservation is. During that time, when we ceded those lands with the U.S. government, we actually retained, which means we kept and reserved specific rights that the tribes had already been doing across the landscape from time immemorial. This includes the right of taking fish, gathering roots, berries, pasturing livestock. Next. So when we really look at what that is, in Article 1 of our treaty, it talks about provided also the exclusive rights of taking fish in the streams running through and bordering said reservations and hereby secured to said Indians and at all other usual and accustomed stations, in common with citizenship of the United States, and of the erecting stable buildings for curing and the same, the privileges of hunting, gathering roots, berry, and pasturing their livestock on unclaimed lands in common with citizenship is also secured to them. Next. So, what we're really talking about, what we really lead a lot of our work that we do with our Department of Natural Resources and the rights that our tribal membership has across the landscape is looking at the exclusive right of taking fish. This is talking about when we're going fishing, we have the right to be in the river in areas that are within that 6 million acres or 6.4 million acres, and usual and custom fishing stations or fishing areas, which reached far beyond those 6.4 million acres, all the way up towards Portland, and in vast areas. And we're able to practice those rights in there. The exclusive right of taking fish, we can be in a river or tributary, even crossing public lands or private lands to the flood bank. So we can be in the river and walking down and back and forth along the river related to that. And when you're talking about tribal treaty rights, and if you look it up, a tribal treaty right is what is considered a superior law of the land because they were established when the laws were first being established within this country. And so, well, like the Umatillas, for instance, our treaty was signed before Oregon became a state, and so our treaty rights supersede Oregon state law, and it comes before. Next slide. So when you're looking at our area is vast and is very important to us because of the traditional use access that we need to be able to go out and to gather and harvest subsistence for our people and within their household, because we still have a lot of Native American people and people that are within our tribe and the local tribes who rely on subsistence food in their house, either because that's the way they've always ate, or it could be economic too, that they don't have they don't have a lot of money to be able to purchase, because most of them, that is predominantly what they eat. And so we have to have the ability to access those foods. And in areas that is how they are today with the cities and private land ownership and landlocked areas, it is very important for us to be able to access those areas and work with landowners, land management people, other areas to get access so we can practice those treaties within that area. This map is showing a density area. If you look at the broader brown area, that is that 6.4 million acres, but we are harvesting still today and gathering within those extended areas. When you see the shadowing of the gray, that represents the areas that our tribe have been continuing to access from time immemorial. Historically, we were traveling all the way down to California to Nevada. We were following the Salt Trail actually all the way down to Utah. And so we are also working on expanding this area based on oral traditions and knowledge that we know from our elders from when we first created this. We go all the way to Montana to go hunt for buffalo. We had our people were also going up into Canada and other areas. In doing this, we work very hard to secure rights to us related to that. In some cases that we have to do a lot of work with states to get those accesses opened up for us. And if those rights are challenged by the state, the federal government has the obligation because of the treaty to help us retain those rights and get those rights, because it is because of those treaties, they're obligated to do that because we are what's considered sovereign nations because of those treaties. So we govern ourselves and be able to have our own policies and laws to help that, and also protect those resources and be able to access them because they are within those treaties. Next slide. So some of the work that we've been moving into in the last 15, 16 years is really taking our traditional ecological knowledge and piling it across of the work we do in natural resources. So back in 2006, we adopted a policy related to our tribe's Tamanwet or Tamalwet, which is a natural law, and it goes back to a creation story that has been told to our tribal people since time immemorial. And the way it's told is like how we tell coyote stories in this past, and it talks about how Creator came to the Creator created all things within the universe, and in that creation, He created all the resources, the earth. He placed everything on the earth, the water, the plants, the animals, and things came forward. And at that time, the earth became populated and flourishing. And then next came the human people, and in that, man and woman. And during that time, the animals and everything stood up to give testimony to how they were going to take care of one another in the beginning of time. And the way that we're told of how we follow is that in the beginning, when we were placed, we were in an area where all things were. For example, an area that we call a leak is kind of where everything is at. And in that area, um, all things were able to speak in one way or form. It was the nusach, the salmon, who stood up to represent all of the aquatic animals. And he gave himself to the people, saying that I will take care of the people. In return, when I return back up the rivers, they will honor me with celebration and have a feast and honor me in this way. After all the other aquatics talked after the salmon, the Yamish, they stood up and gave testimony. That is the deer. And he spoke for all the other animals. And in this, he said that I will come forth and give my body, my hide for clothing, my bones for tools. And in this, you will also take care of me. You can use my hide to create a drum. And in that drum, you'll be able to pray and sing for us. And the drum represents all the heartbeat of all things. Even the earth has a tectonic pulse, and it's living and moving from the core on up. And it is our mother. It gives life to us, and we reborn and go back. And so, with that, all the other species came forward. And when we're talking about the water, which is the first of all things, and the fish species, the animal species, the deer, those are men's foods. They take care of those and monitor those. Then you have the couch, which represents all the root bearing plants. It gave testimony to the woman, talking to the woman and how it's used and how it's used for medicine. After all the root plants gave their testimony, it was the Wiwanu who came forward, which is the huckleberry, representing all the shrub bearing plants from the low shrub all the way to the overstory. So we took that story and we put it into our mission statement to help guide us. When you're looking at those foods, we have a reciprocal responsibility because they gave to us at the beginning of time, and we are their voice now. And in doing that, when we pass, our bodies go back to the ground and nourish them and nourish the earth. So our mission statement incorporated the best part of our natural law, talking about that tamalwat. When you're looking at natural law, it's talking about, for example, the sun rises in the east and it flows, comes all the way over, sets in the west. And after it does that, sorry for my battery is acting up for some reason. After it does that, Colleen, can you take over real quick? My battery's going to shut off, so I want to, before I get locked out.
Yeah, absolutely. If you wanted to turn your camera off, that would be cool too. So this mission statement guides the work that we do for the Department of Natural Resources. And we do this work in a way, this mission statement allows us to have the work that we do be recognizable to the community, the tribal community, and accountable to the tribal community. And we do this work through a couple different ways, utilizing traditional ecological knowledge and cultural knowledge and science to inform population and habitat management goals and actions. That's the on-the-ground work that we're doing. It's the stream restoration, it's the population supplementation through our hatchery programs and our labs. It is the forest management actions that we do on a regular basis. But then we also use natural resource policies and regulatory mechanisms to protect the things that have been built. And that's really the role that my program, the First Foods Policy Program, has in this work, is to protect and monitor the frameworks, those rules that are made that govern the work that we can do. And so there is both on-the-ground action that is designed to support first foods habitat and first foods populations for harvests specifically for tribal members. And I think that that's something that's unique for tribal people in wildlife conservation, is that these are not just things, animals and plants that we get to see when we're out on a hike or a recreation opportunity, like a lot of people who engage in environmentalists and conservationist spaces. These are foods. These are things that people go out to harvest for family and for ceremony and bring back. And, so it's a very different relationship that tribal people have to the land. And it's important to note that tribal people have always managed this land. When settlers moved across the West and came to what is now Oregon, they found this lush, rich landscape that looked like it had been managed and manicured to provide all of this beautiful bounty. And that's because it had been. This land has never not been managed by human hands. And I think that that's something that a lot of environmentalists and conservationists don't quite have a good understanding of. Because when we have conversations with like Forest Service staff about species migration and invasive species pressures, we ask what is now an invasive species, understanding that climate change will force these habitats to shift in their ranges, and so too must species shift with them to survive. Then that kind of throws out of whack what is and isn't a native species or an invasive species. And so when we ask for definitions of these in an uncertain future, we get back responses like, oh, native species is something that hasn't been put there by human action. But the problem with that definition is that tribes have always been moving species around. So species have come to places through their own natural migration, but then they have also been moved and migrated intentionally, facilitated migration by tribal people for their prosperity, for the prosperity of tribal people. And it looks like we might have lost Wenix, so I might have to just kind of chat with you here a little bit about our work. And so I think that I might move along in our slides to get to some of mine, and we will come back to her when she is back on, such as these things are. So you'll get a little bit of a glimpse of some of the cultural information that we'll be sharing, but I'm going to move to some of my slides and hope that she rejoins us shortly. Thanks for bearing with us, and we're excited to hear from her when she gets her technology sorted out. And so the role that I have within the First Foods Policy Program is as Climate Adaptation Planner. And so this is a role that really requires both inward and outward facing responsibility, because we want to both talk within our tribal community about the things that people are experiencing, but then also be able to produce something that's going to go forward to be a resource for our community at large, for non-tribal communities that are seeking to engage in this work, for legislators and lawmakers that are always, if they're doing the right thing, wanting to talk with the tribe and consult with the tribe about different legislative and legal actions that might be taken. And so we have been successful in creating our climate adaptation plan, which is really guided by this adaptation wheel that you see here. And I love the quotes of knowledgeable people are always something that I look to, because there are people that have knowledge far greater than my own, and they leave us with these messages and these lessons. And so one that really resonates with me was Atwe Louis Dick tells us that that which is connected cannot be separated. And it's with that spirit that we approached our climate adaptation work, and that which guides this adaptation wheel that you see here on the screen. And so this wheel is a visual representation of the fact that this work is all connected. And it looks like we have Lennox back on. And so I'm going to return to our cultural slides and talk with you about the wheel in a little bit. Welcome back, Lennox.
Thank you for stepping me out or stepping in. I was plugged into the port that did not work. And so, kind of coming back to those first foods, we look at taking that knowledge and perpetuating that cultural, economic, and sovereign benefits for the tribe. Accomplish this by utilizing that traditional knowledge of our people first, and looking at how we do that, and science to inform two things. First is the population habitat management goals and actions, and natural resources policies and regulatory mechanisms. Tribal people across the landscape and indigenous people throughout the whole entire world have been protecting their resources from time immemorial. And all of us had traditional knowledge related to those home bases, not only here in Africa and places all over Mexico. We knew how to manage the land in a sustainable way, that we could harvest sustainable, and to be able to make the production of that more productive. If there was a place where we seen that the production was going down, we would utilize different type of natural mechanisms to assist in making that a more vital resources. For instance, we would take fire and burn across the landscape in areas that were becoming overcroached, or if we've seen berry fields that were not as plentiful, to be able to use to fertilize the ground, and to be able to open up areas and open up even meadows for living, places for animals to come in. We knew how to balance those in those ways, or looking at restoring salmon to waterways, because the way we fish or we manage, or the way that we harvest in a sustainable way by putting the seed top back into the ground, because it helps replant even of the natural resources that are there that come back that next year. Next slide. So when we're talking about this, when we're talking about the work that we do related to the natural resources and repairing ecosystems, we also have to talk about the relationship that we have to that land, to those teachings, and the importance of that. And so in those teachings of us doing the work to restore, we also have to look at how do we restore knowledge back to our tribal community. And in that, when those foods come back to the landscape, it is our job every year to give thanks for what they give. So we have feasts when the new foods come forward. We have a feast to honor them, and we have a first foods root feast. The week after, we do the first foods root feast, where the community comes together and celebrates that, and we honor and recognize those foods and the work we're doing related to that, and completing that promise we gave to them at the beginning of time. We have another feast that is very important to us, called the Children's Feast. And in that feast, we come together and they bring the children out, and they prepare them for several months, teaching them the first food song. That song they have to sing when they go out and meet the foods for the first time that season. And they sing that song. They stand up from the youngest to the oldest. And then they sing that song. And then when they all come back, they have to come back to where they're standing, is what's called our tribal longhouse. And in that area, when they bring the foods back, they have to circle that place 3 times because of the significance of that food and what they're doing. And then they bring the food in a traditional way, and we have singers there to meet us. And then we sing for the foods and prayers for everyone that went out and the work that they're doing. And so we're working to sustain our culture and teach that and pass that to that future generation. Next slide. So when we're looking at first foods, it is the center of our culture. And these are some pictures that kind of show us women getting ready for the first foods feast. And you see the women here putting food in these bowls. And those foods are all native foods, foods that grow naturally along the landscape. And each food is actually split out into what it is. And when we set the table in a way that those foods are represented by the time they come up in their season. So anything related to the fish will be first, and whatever species that comes to the longhouse for the dinner, it will be placed on the table in the time that it's ready to harvest. So it would be like if you had salmon, the salmon would be first. If somebody brought in Pacific lamprey, that would be right behind the salmon. If they had stillhead would be made, but it would be setting behind that species. And then next would come the meat species, and it'd be the elk, the deer, the other animal species that when you're harvesting them, the roots would start with the first one that comes up is celery, bitterroot, cowsh. Look, they're all sent in a specific order related to the time that they are ready for harvest. Next slide. So when we're looking at this, how are we going to secure the knowledge that we currently have? One of the things that have happened to minority people across this landscape is that for us particular, we were taking and pushed from our indigenous homelands onto reservations and into places where we weren't always able to access those foods. And so we lost language, we lost culture, we lost a lot of information related to the foods and how to be able to access that. And in that loss right now, we're in the time that, we can't look back and say, oh, this happened to me. This is what happened to us. But what are we doing now to secure that? Natural resources is securing that by putting back fish into waters, working on populations of animals to be on the landscape, and fixing the ecological systems across the landscape related to those traditional foods to fix that system to the best of our ability, because we have the ability to do that. We have cultural knowledge from time immemorial, and we have treaty rights, one, to help protect the resources. And if they're not protected, we can fight for that. And the federal government is obligated to help us do that. And because of that, when you're looking at environmental justice, environmental science, and conservation, the treaties help secure conservation to help happen as a vehicle, which is very important. It makes tribal nations very strong. And also the partnership of us partnering with conservation districts and different people. But we also are working to fix the ecosystem in a way that the foods come back naturally so we can harvest sustainability and being able to practice that culture on the landscape, how it was from time immemorial. And looking at that, we're working today to revitalize cultural practices and knowledge that have passed. We have lost, our tribe alone has lost 2 languages where we have no fluent speakers, the Walla Walla and the Cayuse. We currently have been working to document the Nez Perce Cayuse and the Umatilla, which we only have a handful of fluent speakers, but they're working as hard as they can to bring the knowledge as much as they can to the tribal people. We might have lost knowledge across this landscape, but even though we have lost culture, the one thing about cultural practices, when foods are still there, we still have the ability to go out and find those foods and to regain culture. It might not be how it was 1,000 years ago, but we can reinvent our culture and the practice related to a food source or how to make huckleberry baskets. And we can relearn those as long as they're still on the landscape. So it's important for us to protect them while they are here. So one of the things that we're doing is working to bring people back to the landscape, and by going out and doing public excursions and outreach to be able to teach our people about the mission and the work the tribe is doing for tribal people to practice their sovereign rights that we have across that landscape, and to look at identifying food sources, creating maps, ensuring legal access, and maybe reaching out and creating partnerships so we can access areas that we are currently locked out of, and to be able to go out and to teach our people about gathering, harvesting, and how to put that up for future generations, and even for that knowledge within their family. Next slide. So one of the projects we're really working hard on is restoring that traditional first foods access across many areas, but this is a good example of the work we've been doing in the Wallowa Valley with the Wallowa Land Trust and other private landowners in the area, of going out and doing public outreach meetings and letting them know the importance it is for us to get back to the landscape. This is a photo of the Wallowa Mountains, and for many of you that don't know, this is an area that Chief Joseph long ago was that he had treaty rights there and he was there, but he was pushed out because they wanted to open up that area and take that land. And so they were pushed out. And in that, it was the flight of Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce bands, not only the Nez Perce, but you had the Wallowa people bands there. You had the Looking Glass bands there, and you had other bands that were associated to these areas. When you're looking at who Chief Joseph was, and yeah, he was Nez Perce, but he was also, his mother was Cayuse. And so our bloods come from there. My family is Wallowa people and Looking Glass people, and my stories from our families go back to that area. So it's really important that we get our people back there. We had not been back in that area to really be able to root gather, and we can do that in unclaimed open lands, but even then we have times where we have to really force and enforce our tribal treaty rights with the Forest Service, with the BLM, saying that you have to give us access to those areas that are locked because we have treaty rights to be there. Next slide. So when I talk about oral histories and oral stories, this is my namesake, whose the woman is Winix Red Elk, which my name Winix means that echoing through a mountain canyon as it rises off the ground, and Red Elk. And they were from this area. And it's really important that the stories that we have is passed on, not from my mother, not from my father. My grandmother, who was born in 1812, her information came from, prior to those late 1800s. And so the only knowledge and cultural history that we had related to that area is like, we have people that are able to go and hunt, but talking about having that bigger access to be able to practice those rights there, we're coming from people from 3 generations back. Right now, we're working to restore oral history, that a lot of our elders have passed away that have a lot of those stories. And so a lot of oral history is dying, but we still have the ability to create oral history in us today and our youth moving forward. We're creating oral history by bringing our people back. Instead of us having 3 generations of knowledge, we are creating knowledge holders that my daughter can say, this is where I'm from. Next slide. So looking at this area, this is an area that throughout the Zumwalt Prairie, coming out to these areas where the Wallowa Land Trust was opening up areas, and we were working with private landowners to give us access to this. And one of the areas that's so important about this is because when you look at it, it's a raw area. It hasn't been farmed. It's still in the pristine area, because you have a lot of landowners here they're grazing cattle, so they want that open lands. These are what are called like golden areas for us because they've never been altered. That means there's a very good possibility that we have access to foods that have never been touched, that have been just waiting for us to return back to that landscape. And when we go out to these areas, it's very impactful, where we are so moved that sometimes you'll go into an area and then all of a sudden you have these overwhelming emotions that come to you. Like when I first accessed this area and I was driving out there and I was alone, that all of a sudden I kind of seen the landscape, and it had been raining. There was mist coming off of these mountains, and it was almost like a rain misty fog. And there was ravens, or not ravens, there was hawks sitting around all these different areas on fence lines, and the back end of the mountains, it was black from the clouds, but the sun was hitting the land, so it was lit up with this really bright light. We talk about when you see light from the earth, or energy from the earth, it's called Ilikai. It's like this healing light, but it was shined up like that, and all of a sudden I was hit where it was so impactful in me. I had to literally pull over because I started crying. And I'm like, why am I getting so emotional? And then I had to really think about it. It took me 20 minutes to regain myself, where I realized that this is an area that the last time that I had probably been there, someone from my family were made, possibly my ancestors were running from that area to get away from the cavalry, having to escape. And I had the ability as a public outreach coordinator, that I was going there, and I was there that day to look at the land, because I was trying to find an area that the next year I was going to bring people back to. And so this last year I was able to bring children, young adults, and elders back to the landscape to gather in a place they hadn't gathered for almost 200 years. Next slide. When you're looking at why is it so important that we get back to the land, we get back to the areas, because we're able to become reintroduced to species of plants that we gather at home. Well, we started realizing that these two species particular only are growing in that homeland. When we talk about couch, it's a root that we call this little yellow plant that you see there. That is a lomation. And that lomation, that one's a lomation gorami. It means it's like a dwarf, but it only grows there in that area. What we started noticing is that we still see the roots that we usually dig, but they were different. They were smaller, they were shorter, they taste different, their leaf spacing was different. And then we noticed that these are different species of the roots that we have that we hadn't seen since 200 years, so we did not recognize them. And we're like, wow, what is, and we were so excited to be reintroduced. We call them our sisters, our brothers and our sisters, to be reintroduced to the sister that was just sitting there waiting us to re-find her. And the bitter root, where the bitter root usually has a small flower that sets down on top of it, with this one, the flowers come off of it. And so when we're starting to access private land ownership, we're reunited with these brothers and sisters that we have not seen, and the happiness that it brings for us to be able to bring that knowledge back to our people. Next slide. So when you're looking at an area, this is an area, just shows how bountiful this is. So you have white flowers as a new nuts. You have an area that has the Indian strawberries, which we call the little people strawberries. When you pick them, you have to save some. It's for the little people that are still out there. You have the wild onions, you have moss, you have currants. There's so many natural resources for us to be able to go gather there in these areas important to us. In some areas, we can't find those in certain areas where we live. We have to travel for them. Next slide. And so also it's important because we're able to reconnect to tribal communities. So because of our policies, we're not always able to gather with each other in their areas, because we have to keep those resources closer to our homes for tribal membership. And so this is a landscape where we're able to reunite with the Nez Perce tribe, the Colville tribe, and descendants of those Chief Joseph the bands, to help us reestablish physical and emotional ties to the land and to our people. Also to share stories, because we had stories that they had lost. They had stories related to different foods or different resources. There were some foods that they didn't know. There were some foods that we didn't know. So we're able to share and pass teachings that we had back to our people, even if we're from different areas. Because just because we're native, we're all different, and we all have different stories. We have similarities, but things are different, but we can still take the knowledge that we have to help each other regain knowledge so they can bring them back to their communities. Next slide. So, the last couple of years, we're able to have a First Foods feast in the Wallowa Valley. They have a longhouse there. They do practices there, but they hadn't had to where the women go back to the area. The women go out and dig the food from there, bring it to the longhouse, and celebrate that food from there. In 2022, we had the first root feast back to the Wallowa Valley since the time before Joseph ran. And so it was very important. This last year, we had the second one. So we are able to have in our kids' knowledge base, and they say, oh, yeah, we went to Wallowa and we digged roots there. They couldn't say that for a couple hundred years. So it was very substantial of us healing and returning back to the landscape. Next slide.
So thank you, Wenix Kisiaya, for sharing all that cultural knowledge. And it is really important to start with that because everything springs from those first foods. And so I chatted with you a little bit about the adaptation wheel already, and I'm not going to rehash some of that. But again, we want to look at this work centering the first foods and understanding that tribal people have this knowledge and have had this knowledge since time immemorial. And so our work with climate adaptation looks to the first foods and continues that first foods mission out into an uncertain future. And our climate adaptation plan doesn't attempt to disentangle climate change impacts from tribal dispossession of lands and current land use and management strategies, because these things are all interconnected and tangled in a way that just cannot be separated. And so this plan makes no attempt to do so. And I know that we're in good company because for the first time, the most recent IPCC climate change report has a sentence in it that recognizes the role of global colonization as a driver of the climate crisis. Yeah, it is just one sentence, but they have it in there. And so that was a huge step forward for us. And so for me, I'm excited to chat with you more about some tangible examples of this work and how we are using the efforts that WENX has described to further our climate adaptation work. But first, I always want to honor the people who are actually doing this work and the cost of that work. And those are the people who are water protectors and land defenders in this world. And so down on the right-hand corner, you can see the cover of a recent Indigenous Environmental Network report that talks about the role that Indigenous resistance to 21 fossil fuel projects over the last decade has had, and it has staved off 25% of the annual carbon emissions from those nations, which is the equivalent of 1.5 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide, an equivalent of 345 million passenger vehicles, which is more cars than either of those nations have. And so they do this not because they got a grant or a government sponsorship to do this work. They do this work in the face of horrific police brutality and state-sanctioned violence. And so I always want to honor the people who are doing this work, the land defenders and the water protectors. I stand in solidarity with you. And I especially want to note the fight that's going on with the Mountain Valley Pipeline and Stop Cop City down in Atlanta, and the 61 people who are just slapped with RICO charges for trying to stand up for what is a carbon sink in an urban area. Your fight is my fight, and I stand with you. And it's also important to recognize that the climate crisis has this connection with the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples epidemic, that Global Witness reported that over 1,700 climate activists around the world have been murdered in the last 10 years. And many of these are Indigenous land defenders. And so I want to echo some of the sentiments that speakers yesterday had, that the fossil fuel industry and exploitation capitalism has a body count, that there is very real harm being done by these systems. And so into the work itself, we published our CTUIR climate adaptation plan in December of 2022, so at the very end of last year, and it was adopted by our tribal government through Resolution 22103. And even the development of this plan was an example of tribal adaptation in real time. And I want to recognize that our climate adaptation plan isn't anything new, but what it does is it weaves together and documents existing practices and plans with an eye towards the future, because the future does not look like the past. And so if we are using historical data to inform future planning, we are planning for a future that does not exist. And Indigenous people have always been adapting to natural changes in climate since time immemorial, and have survived both natural and man made world ending events many times over. And so it makes sense to turn to people and practices that have literally survived the end of the world for this next world ending event. And I have been thinking about a lot about the phrase the value of a longhouse and the tremendous work and energy produced by the religious and community spaces, and all religious and community spaces, but tribal spaces particularly, and the work that it does in service to people in our time of climate crisis, and how this value isn't really accounted for when we look at regional planning, especially for energy generation projects and more recently carbon capture proposal projects. And so, Wenix, I wanted to know if you had anything that you'd like to add to this particular topic.
Just like Colleen stated, is that we have been doing work to secure our resources from time immemorial. And when you're looking at climate, we see those changes every day when we go out. The seasons are shorter. Um, it's hotter. Sometimes we go out the same time we did the year before, and the roots are already gone. They're not there no more. And so it's very important for us to be able to work to follow them and understand them better.
And so, Wenix talked about landlocked foods and the urgent need for Indigenous people to be able to access ancestral lands. And when we look at climate crisis impacts, we also see other ways of access that is being affected by climate impacts. There are tangible and intangible barriers to access. And so those tangible barriers are things like Wenix talked about, the private land ownership literally locking tribal people out of the land. But there are also intangible barriers to access. And these are things like the extreme heat events that we've been experiencing and the smoke inundation. These are intangible barriers because of the risk of exposure that these carry. And they often are actually physical barriers as well, because, like the photo on the right hand side here, we have wildfire threats to roadways, causing roadway closures to a lot of our national forests where harvest opportunities exist. But we know that tribal people keeping ancestral connections to place is a climate resilience and is climate adaptation in of itself. And so, how can we protect tribal hunters, fishermen, and gatherers while still supporting opportunities for harvest? The photo down on the right left, the right corner at the bottom, was an image taken of a monitor here in our area 3 years ago yesterday. And it shows that the air quality was terrible at that time. And so we actually in Mission registered over 800 parts per million from smoke from near and far wildfire burning. And so this time of year is the tail end of berry season. So people are still out picking huckleberries, and it's the start of hunting season. And so we see this terrible smoke conditions being a barrier to accessing first foods harvest opportunities. Wenix, anything to add?
Um, a good example when you're really thinking about this is that during this year, and we've had a lot of smoke events this year too, where some of us can't go in those areas because, like me and my daughter, we have had pneumonia in the past and had some struggles with COVID and everything related to it was so bad that we weren't able to go outside. And luckily, Colleen's program gave us some air filters to help assist us and provide us ventilators to be able to go harvest if we have the ability to get out there to help protect us and protect our lungs. When you have tribal fishermen that are along the river, the image that you see, like you kind of see a silver, kind of a silver thing in the water. That is the bow of the boat. And this was actually on the good day of the smoke, where the fishermen they had 30. So my person in particular, they were fishing on the river and they had 30 nets. These are gill nets, which are, anywhere from 200 to 400 feet long. And they had 30 of them out during the season that they're able to go out and fish and be able to sell from the banks because they have those rights because of the treaty. So when the smoke was down, it was so bad that they could not see each other from the bow of the boat. And this is the river, the Columbia River, which is a big main tributary going through there that has barges. And so it was very dangerous for them. And so for the month that all the smoke was there, when the fish are there, when the foods are there, you are there. You don't have the ability not to be there, especially for tribal fishermen, that is their livelihood. And they are providing food for multiple families on several different reservations that they might be gifting. Because in this year, they really didn't sell. They were catching fish to hand out to families during that pandemic season. And they are affected by the smoke that was in that area. Next slide.
Wenx, you set me up nicely for the introduction to our Preparing for Fire project. Recognizing that wildfires near and far are likely to be our new normal. Like this year we got away and it still could get smoky, but this is going to continue to be a problem. And so Western public health recommendations to shelter in place are not something that tribal people can abide by long term, because the first foods wait for no one. And so you have to be there when they are there, regardless of the conditions. And so again, it's important for our program, for our climate adaptation work, to recognize that tribal people need to be on the land. That is what we want. But how can we protect people and give people the information, the skills, and the equipment that are necessary to mitigate for these risks as much as possible? And so we had the honor of working with Meyer Memorial Trust's Healthy Environments Grant for our Preparing for Fire project. And this project aimed to teach families about air quality and risk mitigation for decision making so that families could autonomously make good decisions. We don't want the government to always be dictating what it is that tribal families should be doing. We want families to have the information that they need to make good decisions for what they want out of life. And so with this funding, we purchased air quality personal protective equipment and air filtration units for residences, for high priority residences, which is something that Wenx had described. And we worked with our Yellow Hawk Health Clinic to identify the people who are most vulnerable to smoke impacts and to make sure that they were first in line for this equipment. And then we also purchased these IQ Air Visual Pros that were actual air monitors that have kind of a display screen. You saw it in the previous slide that tell you what your indoor air quality is versus what it is in a local outdoor station, so that you can see what your risk is staying home, because not all homes are made the same. The thing about shelter in place orders is it assumes that your home is going to be buffered against smoke infiltration. But what we see from literature is that oftentimes the air quality in homes is 75 to 100% of what it is of outdoor air quality. And so at that point, if you're at 90 to 100% of outdoor air quality, you might as well just be outside. So, and then there are some places, sometimes when the smoke is heavily localized. And so going out to exercise treaty rights of going up into the mountains actually gets you into more cleaner air. And so we want people to have the skills and the information at their disposal to make good decisions. And people have been so impressed with this project that we were actually consulted by several representatives last year. Last year, I think. For the creation of the Cleaner Air Spaces Act with Representatives Scott Peters and Senators Michael Bennet and Jeff Merkley. And the other component of this project was preparing people for a returning of cultural burning to the land. And so we wanted to inspire a shift in forest management policy. And the history of land dispossession comes in very heavily when we look at forest management. There's been over 100 years of U.S. Forest Service fire suppression policy that has created overcrowded forests with really high vegetation loads in the undercanopy that create conditions for mega fires that are not natural to our landscapes. And so we need to figure out how to return low intensity cultural and prescribed burning back to the land. and return a missing element to our ecosystems. And we have this really amazing plot of land, the Rainwater Wildlife Area, that has been putting that into practice. And so we have the ability to demonstrate what Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous management looks like on the ground. But we also need to have good information for that. And so the last component of our Preparing for Fire project was to increase local and accurate knowledge about weather conditions to conduct burns safely. And so we purchased a remote automated weather station, a RAWS station, for our fire crews so that they could place it where they were going to do the burn and get the most accurate conditions, weather conditions for their go, no go decisions. And only about 1% of prescribed burns go out of control. And that's an important thing to know because in May of 2021, there was this incident that happened in Oregon where a U.S. Forest Service burn boss is the person that is conducting a prescribed burn, the person at the top in command of that prescribed burn operation. In Grant County, Oregon, they were conducting a prescribed burn that jumped a fence line and burned some grassland and private property. And the sheriff of Grant County actually came out and arrested that burn boss in the middle of a prescribed burn. And so this is something that had really a chilling effect across the nation. And it actually affected even one of the burns that we were going to conduct up at Rainwater. And so here we see again an intersection of policing with Indigenous management. You know, there's been a history of tribal people being arrested and imprisoned for conducting cultural practices. And so this is just another example of that. And it really does speak to, again, what Wenix was talking about being landlocked out of certain areas, that we see this patchwork of ownerships and a checkerboard even on the Umatilla Indian Reservation. Wenix, anything to add?
No.
No? Okay. And so when we start talking about adaptation, it's really important that we not repeat the mistakes of the past. And so there are 3 points that I'd like to draw attention to in the context of our Preparing for Fire project. And one is that the equipment that we've purchased for people to be safe, both in their homes and out on the land, largely comes from companies that continue to pollute and continue to make exorbitant amount of money climate profiteering off of our suffering. And so I wanted to note that 3M is a producer of a lot of filtration equipment, but they earlier this year settled one of the largest water contamination settlements in our country's history at $10.1 billion, and still faces thousands more lawsuits on water contamination from counties and municipalities regarding PFAS contamination of waters. And the other thing that I'd like to note is that our first responders, our wildland firefighters, are bearing a disproportionate burden of health impacts from being out in that smoke constantly. So not only is it a chronic exposure to smoke, which is not good, it's an acute exposure as well. So not only are they taking in large quantities of smoke, they're doing so over long periods of time with the knowledge that it's an increase in both brain, lung cancers and cardiac illness as a result of that. And this is important to note because in 2020, for the first time, we saw the state of Oregon use incarcerated firefighter labor to fight wildfires. And these incarcerated units were sent out 25 times or more in 2020, making less than $10 a day doing this extremely dangerous work. And so when we were explaining this to Dr. Wilson about this issue, I'll echo his words, explain to me how that's not slavery. And this is important because Native Americans make up a disproportionate amount of people who are incarcerated in Oregon and Washington. You see the chart on the right that's for Washington specifically, but Native Americans make up roughly 1.4% of the general population of Oregon and Washington, but make up about 4% of incarcerated people in those states. And so it is important that when we look at wildfire response and fire management, that we are not repeating the mistakes of the past and using Native people as incarcerated labor, but that we are putting Native people at the forefront of this work and recognizing them for their knowledge and their contribution to this work. Lennox, anything to add?
Not yet.
Okay. And so, with that lens of trying to do things differently as we adapt to an uncertain future, again, we published our climate adaptation plan at the end of last year, and we turned right back around and started to bring it back to our community for validation and participation in evaluating it, because our community is everything. You can write something on a piece of paper, and just because it's written on a piece of paper doesn't mean anyone is going to follow it. Your work has to exist in the community or it doesn't exist at all. And so the plan was a product of the pandemic that instead of canceling our outreach like many others did when the pandemic first started, we were able to turn this into an opportunity to spend a longer period of time with our community virtually and invite our tribal knowledge keepers and community to be the experts in this work. And so, as we go forward, bringing this back to the community, we aim to continue to try and be as accessible as possible, offering hybrid and alternative attendance options to all of our sessions. And we have our archive, our climate adaptation YouTube channel, which the QR code is up there for it if anybody is interested, so that those who miss out on a live viewing of our presentations are able to find it and watch it on their own time. And so 2023 has really been our year of review of the climate adaptation plan. And we've also included a component that we call policy in action, where we wanted to offer case studies of existing policies and programs that are considered climate adaptation, so that we can demonstrate tribal climate adaptation leadership. Because seeing is believing, and we believe our neighbors, right? Like, especially in rural areas, you're going to believe your neighbor more than you're going to believe a person from the government. And so we wanted to make sure that our work is accessible so that people can see what we are doing and see the success and say, well, why can't I do that as well? And so the two photos on the bottom left and middle are from some of our events. And so on the left, you see our rainwater tour. We went up and toured that rainwater wildlife area, and we took a bunch of people up with us. We took the casino bus up Tulin into the mountains. It was a very exciting day, but we were able to actually also film it and edit that and provide that at the back end, so that people who weren't able to get to the tour either for timing or mobility or whatever, still were able to access that information and see what we were seeing. And in the middle, you see our First Foods Pollinators workshop, where we were able to bring microscopes and bumblebees and other kinds of bees that are First Foods pollinators and have tribal members be able to look at them. We brought them to the Nikiawe Governance Center, right, where people are working and living. And so it was a great opportunity for people to get to see and engage with our insect friends that are often overlooked. And this coming year, we're going to be working with our Department of Environmental Quality with the state for our climate pollution reduction grant through the EPA to get ready for some of those IRA and BIL implementation dollars that are forthcoming. Anything to add, Wenix?
Yes. So when you're looking at the work that the tribe is doing and the natural resources doing, and looking at how do we fix this landscape, how do we look at fixing these ecological processes, we are starting from the bottom of the landscape, from the tributary all the way up to the uplands, including the forest. And when we're managing on all areas, looking at everything from the water to the plants to the animals to the bees. And how do we fix that landscape? And then we're not just fixing that landscape for us, but for the planet and for everyone else that lives around and is interacting with this, because it is important to fix this Mother Earth and this earth as long as we can, because this is the one place that we have. Everybody's always looking for getting off the land or colonizing other places, and we need to look at making sure that our planet is as healthy as possible. And because it's not, how do we get there and continue to work on repairing it? Because this is the planet that we are currently living on and the importance of that. So when they're talking about the climate adaptation plan, and when you're looking at climate, it is different for each area, even though it's, worldwide because it's affected everywhere. But what can we do in our landscape, in our area, to fix that and create a climate plan that is responsive to the tribe, to our treaty rights, to our people, to what we're doing and what we recognize and how we see the effects recognized on the natural plants and animals that other people don't recognize as much as we do, because we have knowledge related and how to repair those landscapes and how do we get there. And we're not big, but we still are mighty in the efforts that we're doing and ability to work forward to that and to be in front of everything that's coming at us as fast as we can. And then once we have the adaptation plan, we can continue to update and continue to roll with whatever's facing us from day to day, or the different things that are coming at us, and how do we get there to the best of our abilities.
And so when we look at how do we do that, I wanted to share just a couple of things that we've got going here that we're really excited about. And so it was interesting listening to the day one speakers of this conference. I tuned into the CAFO conversation where, boy, methane anaerobic digesters just took a beating. And I understand that in that really industrial context, that might not be a favorite solution. But what we are looking at for anaerobic digestion is the food waste actually that is generated. And so food waste will always be generated. There are, not every part of the plant is edible immediately. And so there's always going to be some amount of food waste that's generated, even from things like longhouse feasts. And so our Nikiawe Aku Champa Chaupam Akata project, our Nikiawe Don't Throw It Away project, is designed to focus on food waste from longhouse to be diverted into a small scale biodigester. And so it's like this little thing which will turn into direct use cooking fuel and be used for longhouse cooking. And this project is designed to really look at the prevention of methane from when food and biological materials goes into landfills, either small ones on the reservation, or we have a regional landfill in Arlington, Oregon, that sits along the Columbia River. And so it's this opportunity to demonstrate to our community things about food waste and material management, community energy supply resilience, carbon capture, and community capacity to do this work. And so we're really excited to learn about the opportunity and the potential for community scale anaerobic digesters to play a role in regional energy generation, because one thing that we're concerned about for energy generation is base load. And this is a phrase that is the energy that's always there. There's base load and there's peaking load. And so with things like solar panels, they're great for intermittent peaking load, but they cannot generate base load. And so the only thing really that we have right now that generates baseload is fossil fuels, nuclear energy, and hydroelectric energy. And neither of those, none of those is preferable to the tribe. And so this is an opportunity for us to look at an alternative that generates baseload so that we can start having some more honest conversations about salmon passage and our Snake and Columbia River dams. And we're also excited for the opportunity for this project to plug into our $1.2 million PFAS toxins grant that we were awarded recently to examine bio outputs from that digester to look at what kind of PFAS levels might the community be experiencing on kind of the back end, so to speak. Anything to add, Wenix?
Not on the slide thing.
Okay. And so adaptation, legacies, and barriers. We know that living indigenously is climate resilience, and this is what we choose to focus on, that we want to create opportunities and avenues for people to return to Indigenous living, a modernized Indigenous living, as our climate adaptation. And when we speak to our community about barriers to living indigenously, time is the biggest thing that comes up. And so we have this really interesting initiative that's really in its early phases where we're looking at the Hanford nuclear reservation. The Hanford Nuclear Reservation exists within the CTOIR's ceded lands as the northern boundary and contains some of the most contaminated soils on the Earth. And so in 1943, the site was used for enriching plutonium for the nuclear weapons that were used in the Manhattan Project. And the federal government deposited hundreds of millions of gallons of radioactive waste directly into ground in injection wells, trenches, and buried dams, as well as discharged contaminated cooling water directly into the Columbia River. And so there really is this legacy of harm that the Hanford Nuclear Reservation has for the tribe now and ongoingly. The half-life of these radioactive materials is millennia. And so the tribe is negotiating for damages that will persist for thousands and thousands of years. But we are also excited for the opportunity that this gives us to look at first foods as food rather than in a conservation framework. And we're doing so by using a recent opportunity that was created within the 2018 Farm Bill for tribes to be able to administer its own food assistance programs. That's FDIPR, the Food Distribution Program on Indian Reservations, through a 638 contract, which means that the tribe basically takes that over and administers that project. And we're honored to be the second round of that pilot program. Our Department of Child and Family Services has been spearheading that initiative, and we're super excited to see what they come up with. But we're also using this as an opportunity to look at first foods and harvest around that, and make sure that we are accounting for the time and the skill and the energy that goes into that from our tribal harvesters, and to be able to use this as a workforce development vehicle. We want tribal harvesters to be able to, quote, make a living by providing first foods to our most vulnerable. And we think that this is a really exciting avenue to pursue that kind of framework. Any thoughts, Wenix?
When we're talking about our foods, we just currently refound our Indian Wapato, our Indian potato that had been, it was eradicated in some cases because they're trying to colonize in the area and take that food source, because it was one that always grew in the same areas that we could access even through the wintertime. Also, when the dams inundated and flooded out areas, they flooded out a lot of the areas where that Wapato grew. So we reconnected to it. When we found it, it was in the upper part of the Columbia below the Hanford Reach. So the first time that we dug it in over 80 to 100 years, we had to take the food resource because it was, really deep in the water, deep in the ground, and it was in the water, the Columbia. We had to take the food out to be tested. So to find out if that food source was actually clean enough for us to be able to eat and bring back to our people so we could start harvesting in that way.
Okay, and I think we're running out of time, so I'm going to try and hit this one as quickly as possible. But it's important that this is kind of the linchpin of our conversation. We were invited to participate with this environmental justice summit because of the work that this tribe is doing, but not all environmental justice communities are equal. And in fact, tribes exist as an example above and have greater protective mechanisms for this work than other environmental justice communities. And so because the expanding U.S. imperialism, as it marched across the land west, it signed treaties with tribal nations. And in signing treaties with tribal nations, it recognized them as equals on an international stage. And so this provides additional protections, like we see with the federal trust obligation, where we can force the federal government to do certain actions that other communities might not be able to. And it establishes trust obligation to ensure health and sovereignty that, as Wenix said, extends over states. And this was really put into action with the legal precedent set in April of 2018 with the Washington State versus the United States, what is known as the Culvert case, when the United States government sued the Washington State government on behalf of tribes' treaty right to fish. Fishing didn't mean just the right to dip one's net into an empty river, but it required Washington State to correct passage barriers that prevented salmon from flourishing as an extension of this treaty right. And tribal people are also U.S. citizens, which gives them the right that is extended, the rights and protections that are extended to that identity as well. And so, two things that we see really be strengthened are the First Amendment right to religious freedom. Tribes' religion is based in the land and requires a living and vibrant ecosystem with ancestral connection, and so can be protected through First Amendment arguments, as well as a collective Fifth Amendment right to protection and liberties, protect liberties and freedoms that extend to individuals as well as to the tribe as a collective. And tribes are also protected in international arenas as well under the 2007 Indigenous or UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People in the face of uncooperative domestic governments. And we also see tribes be able to submit amicus briefs for rights of nature, like the Monoman that White Earth Nation brought. And we see rights of future generations, like the Juliana case that has yet to have its day in court, as well as Montana youth lawsuit that has been given clearance to go forward. And then we also see Puerto Rico bring RICO charges against Exxon, which was filed in 2020. And so I'm going to move on so that WENX can close. And thank you so much for having us with you today.
The circle has not yet ended. Deeds of such magnitude cannot be undone and over with, as many of you believe. They cannot stand alone in period of time. Their tentacles reach out to oncoming generations and touch the life of our people. We live centuries before the deeds themselves seem only echoes in history. I am an Indian living in the present now, but I, like all my people, carry the burden of those distant years. So do you, whether Indian or white. We cannot be undone, separated from the past, for what happens to our ancestors over the past centuries has had its large share in molding the characters that is ours today. I'm going to end with, when we're speaking of this work and these resources, it is very important. And we have songs that talk about the foods preparing themselves. And I'm going to sing a really short part of that to end our part of this in the relationship of us returning to the land and the water and the importance of this. Ona mata tukatat hana kanasha. Ona mata tukatat hana kanasha. Heya, 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 heya. Hona chushi pasapaki kana. Ona chushi pasapaki ka wakishawetna. Heya, 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 heya. We do not live in the past. We live in the present, and everything that you've seen from the pictures to the work we do is what we are. Our culture is living to this day. Thank you.